Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second data hour. I am so thrilled to be here with all of you and really excited to dive into what I like to think of as like virtual office hours. Something we don't do very often, and I don't think a lot of people do in general. So this is a really unique opportunity to get your data questions answered live by our amazing expert, Barb, who I'm going to introduce in just a few minutes. But before we do get started, I want to go over a couple quick logistical things. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Lauren. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing and Community at Power to Fly. Lots of new names on this attendee list, so that is really cool. I'm so excited to have you all here. Welcome. If you have been on these chats before, you know that I like to keep things very casual and very interactive. So as we were saying before, if you can turn your cameras on, we would really appreciate it. Totally get it if you are at work and you can't turn your camera on. That's why we have our amazing chat box. So I really encourage everyone to, start typing in their questions, regardless of their specificity. We will try and dive in as best as possible. Like we were just saying, last time we got to really dive into Tableau and do some Python coding live right on screen. So no question is too big or small, and I'm sure Barb will let us know if it's doable or not on the call. But until we get some of those more technical questions, we're going to go through all of your pre-submitted questions, which I will pop on the screen momentarily. The last bit that I want to talk about, and I promise you I will be done talking soon, but we are recording today's chat. So if you're not tuning in live, I definitely encourage you to, reach out to Barb personally, listen to the chat in its entirety, and feel free to ask additional questions. Like I said, we'll be following up with any of the resources that we talk about today. And this is going to be a really good opportunity for you to not only network with Barb, but everybody else on the call. So very excited to have you all here. Please participate. And without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Barbara to all of you on the call today. So she's amazing. She's so smart and so talented. I am thrilled to have you back. So I would love for you just to give everyone who's on the call maybe a little insight into what you do, and then we can get started.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That's so nice. So I'm Barb. I have a bachelor's in applied statistics, and I've been doing math and stats my whole life. I started as a data analyst at an insurance company, and the nerd that I am, it wasn't enough math. So then I went to work directly for a statistician who did statistical consulting, primarily for lawyers, actually. So the national court cases you'd see on TV, he would go and testify, and I would do everything with him up until the point where he walked into the courtroom. It was a great job, but he started retiring, and I thought, I'd love to keep doing this kind of thing. Maybe not necessarily for lawyers. We've had a couple of law projects, but mostly for corporations. So I started my own consulting company called Foxplot, and we do, the questions that came in for this chat, the type of things that we do all of the time. So I'm really excited to answer them and go through them. And our current clients now, like I said, are primarily corporate, couple nonprofit, couple legal, couple different things, but we are a purely statistical consulting company. So it doesn't really matter the industry. If you have data, you're trying to make a decision from the data, we help with that kind of thing. I also do some work. One of my clients is General Assembly. And then at the bottom there, you can see I have listed the different, again, that's not every single program that I've ever used or know, but the most common ones.
Amazing. So, we can talk about everything, and I feel like we can talk about all these things for days. But I want to dive into some of these questions, which I'm going to pop on the screen really quickly so you can kind of see what we're going to be talking about today. So, like I said, this is kind of the flow that we have set up right now, but our goal here is to really interact with you who are on the call today. So if you have a specific question about your data, perhaps something's not working, you want to troubleshoot, or you just want another set of eyes, or how to work a visualization, whatever that may be, feel free to start typing in the chat your question, or even hop off mute. I believe there's a little raise hand feature. I can see you and give the mic over to you accordingly. But the point here is to be interactive and to get your questions answered. So until I see that chat box highlight, I'm going to start with our first question. And I think this is a really good place to start because the possibilities are endless here as far as I'm aware. But which are your favorite tools when compiling data for visual presentation and why?
Yes, this is a great question. I get this question all the time. So it does depend firstly on the data set. If it's a large data set, you're not, and by large, I mean over 1 million rows, Excel is already out. Excel has a limit. It's just not going to hold it. Excel will start slowing down too once you get to hundreds of thousands of rows. So if it's a very large data set, already you're looking at Tableau or Python or R or one of the coding languages. My personal favorite tool has become Python and deploying visualizations to the web, because when I'm making something for our clients, I want them to have a really, really great experience and just easy. And when you deploy something to the web, everyone has a web browser, and I don't have to worry about, do you have the same version of the web browser? I mean, there's older browsers and such, but it pretty much always works. So they can be on vacation and on their smartphone, and they can see all the charts and visualizations that I made for them. Whereas if I do it in Excel, they also need Excel, and then they need the same version, or it might not appear the same, and you kind of get into that mess. So that's definitely become my favorite tool is coding in Python for data visualization because of the ease of deploying it to the web. Other tools definitely do that. You can deploy to the web with Tableau. Tableau is very expensive though, so a lot of clients kind of don't want to go, or the people that I am typically working with don't want to go down that route because of the expense. Python is free, and if I deploy it to the web, it's free for you to log in and view it. And then, of course, you know, I'm sure Excel has web-based applications now too. So it does depend on the situation. I mean, I think Tableau is fantastic. I like it a lot. It's just a very pricey tool for most people, and they need usually Tableau or some kind of license to also view it. So for all of those reasons, Python with the different libraries, like we use HighCharts and Pandas libraries to actually make the visualizations and deploy them, has become my favorite.
Great.
And if anybody has follow-up questions, please go ahead and interrupt me. Like Lauren said, I don't mind if you come off microphone.
Yeah, come off microphone or type them in the chat. I'm watching both, so feel free. Our next question is, what are the best practices for use of color in data visualizations?
Yeah, another great question. So I do think color consistency would probably be my top pick for a best practice. Like if you use the color orange somewhere, and let's say that you're ranking your salespeople in your organization, and salesperson Jim is orange in one chart. Orange should be Jim in every other chart that you do, because someone is going to make the association. And now the first time they see Jim as orange, you know, if the orange bar is Jim in the bar chart, but then you go to the pie chart and orange means something else, it's going to take them a second to kind of readjust, or they might not even notice at all, depending on how you set everything up. So I would definitely keep things as consistent as possible. And then also, I dislike color associations more than anyone, I promise. But unfortunately, they're sometimes ingrained into people's brains. So for example, if you're mapping or plotting a geography thing, make the water blue. You know what I mean? Like people are going to associate water with blue. So if you switch it up, it's going to confuse people. And then finally, a decent variety of distinct colors. So you don't want tons of rainbow, you know, giant, like you don't want it to be obnoxious either, but if you have different shades of blue in a pie chart or something like that, or it could kind of become difficult to distinguish between slices or bars depending on what you're looking at. So those would be my top 3 best practices. And I it's not just from me, I got some of those from a book too. There's a great book called Creating More Effective Graphs, if anybody's looking for a book recommendation, that talks about some of these things too.
And correct me if I'm wrong, did you show last time a good resource that has sets of colors that are good to use together, or was that someone else?
That I don't think that was me. There is a lot of color theory out there, right? And like Edward Tufte and all that. you can people can dive into that. Sometimes I think it's a little overkill personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to give my top 3 there, but yeah, there's definitely like so much about hue and saturation, and you could go for weeks on that.
Crazy. I got a good question in the chat. So, which BI suites would you recommend to small businesses, preferably low to no cost recommendations?
Right, so not Tableau, right? Because Tableau is very, very expensive. I have used Power BI. I have not used it extensively. Most of my clients just don't have it for whatever reason. So I'm told it's very cheap, and I'm told it's pretty comparable to Tableau. If you have the ability to hire someone that knows Python or learn Python, and that's not an easy thing to do, it's going to take a year at least for someone to get comfortable if they're starting from scratch. That's free. Python is free. And then R is also free, but same story as Python. It's not something you're going to pick up quickly, and nobody will. You know, it's like learning a foreign language. You don't start speaking French the day after you start learning it. And then if you're working with primarily smaller data sets, Excel isn't horrible. You know, it's not going to do mapping very well, geographic visualizations, but it's going to do the majority of what you need if your data sets are small enough that they can fit into there. Those would probably be my top 3. And I have used that, like I'm purposefully not mentioning other ones because I know ones that I don't like. So yeah, I'll keep it positive though. Those are the ones I like.
So another question, is there any high level psychology behind color theory and use of color in data visualizations? If so, how much attention / time should you give to color in data visualizations?
Yeah, this is what I was alluding to a little bit before with like, I personally have never found the need to go really deep into like that kind of thing. The psychology, it's out there, of course. And, you know, there is color psychology and theory and all that, but I've never found it necessary for getting a point across or making an effective chart. Like I said, I usually stick by those top 3 rules with color, which is, again, differentiation, like so you can see the difference easily. Clarity is like number 1 when you're doing data visualizations, and all 3 of those kind of get back to clarity. So right, the distinction in the colors, color associations, and then color consistency. You could look into all those things. I'm not saying it's like wrong or bad to, you know, go down that path. I just don't know how much it'll add to what you're doing.
And I'm curious about Tableau. Who is using Tableau if it is so expensive? Is it really just major enterprises? Like, I'm curious how even people how do they learn it if it is so inaccessible?
I mean, I know that it's used I've worked with a couple of larger companies, or I have friends that work at larger companies that are using it. Vanguard, Bloomberg, I know they both use Tableau. And then there are some maybe smaller companies that really, really want Tableau and are willing to pay for it. When I say it's astronomical compared to like Excel and Power BI. It's not so astronomical that I couldn't imagine it fitting into a smaller company's budget, but most people look at the price tag and are like, oh my God. So yeah, it is, I think, a lot of larger corporations or people who really, really badly need the functionality. Like Tableau is fantastic at mapping and maps, and Excel is not. So if you're a company that does a lot of maps and you need that, then you are going to have to pay for Tableau or ArcGIS or something that does mapping really well.
Great questions. So continuing on with Tableau, Tableau, I have a license and Tableau account and have built a big project on it. The license ends soon and I want to move all the work I have done into a public account. Is that possible?
Yeah, I had to look this one up. So I thank this person for submitting it in advance because I've never done that particular thing. I have a private license, but I did find a help page that I believe talks about how to at least publish the workbooks to their web. And then I think at that point you can probably convert over. That I think is also a little bit more of a Tableau technical question than like data analytics. So I'll send I'll just put it in the chat here, the help article that I found so that it'll at least get it published to the cloud, and then I imagine at that point you can switch it over, but their help team might be better than I am for something like migrating files.
Yeah, good point. So do you have an established process when creating a dashboard, a specific order that you like to do things in? What does that look like for you?
Yes, I definitely do. So when I'm starting a project and I'm going to try to keep this brief because I could go on all day about this one. When I start a project, of course, the first thing you do is you go through every column in the data set, assuming the data set is set up like a standard data set with the column titles at the top and your rows going across. If it's a quantitative column and I think it's relevant, I'll get like a minimum, a maximum, an average. Like I'll do a typical exploratory analysis, and I know that's not in the scope. That's not this question, so I won't go over extensively what exploratory analysis looks like right now, unless again somebody comes in the chat and says they want that. But you go through the data set, and then I really try to plan out how it's going to look and work together. And I usually actually start on pen and paper, not the computer. So I will take a piece of scrap paper, I've got a whole stack for the environment, and I'll sit there and draw out in pencil, like, what if I did this variable by this variable, and I did it as multiple pie charts at the top, and then below that I did a line plot, and then a bar chart, and then I'll get like halfway through and be like, nope, don't like this, crumple it up, throw it out, start all over again. And again, I recycle all paper. But yeah, I actually think drawing it out first is a really good way to go, because you want the things that are most important towards the top, and you don't want the dashboard to go on forever. Some experts, I think it was Stephen Few, but don't hold me to that said dashboard should even be like one view, one screen. You don't want to keep scrolling, and that's not always the case. Like obviously there's exceptions to everything, but I do try to keep it so that it's pretty like right there. Because when you have to scroll, it kind of becomes hard to interpret a graph, remember what that graph result was, then go to the next one and interpret that and remember it. And you know, by the 10th graph, you've forgotten now what the first one was, and you're not really putting together a cohesive story. So sometimes it'll also involve little, in Excel, they're called slicer tools, where you can click and dynamically change the dashboard. And that might be better than making a whole new graph that someone has to remember. So all of that requires extensive planning. Like I'll never just start making it in Excel. I'm almost always, especially if it's a huge data set, like one time I had 1,800 variables, and you have to go through every single one. And do I need this? And if so, I need to understand that variable really well. And then how am I going to combine it with the other variables? Because there's going to be tons of options. And then what charts are important? And then where do those charts go? It's a long process. It's not something that you're going to do quickly, but that's usually kind of the order. And again, this is very high level, but the order in which I do things for a dashboard.
That's great. And again, continue to pop your questions in the chat. We're getting some in now, so keep it up, everyone. So going back to kind of like cost analysis, so I was very curious about all these questions. On the other side of the cost spectrum, have you ever come across Informatica users? Thoughts on that platform?
Informatica? No, I haven't. That's actually one that I don't think I've even heard of. And I've usually at least heard of some of the, or most of the programs. No, I haven't. I'm sorry.
I'll have to look that one up and get an answer later.
Yeah, I can definitely look into it. What the question was about the cost.
Yeah. And if you knew anyone who used it.
If they have a trial, I'll certainly download it after the call and poke around and give my thoughts. I mean, all of these programs usually are pretty similar, so it won't take me long to poke around and form an opinion. So yeah, I'll look into that, but I have not used it before.
Cool. Our next question is, what was the most impactful data story you've ever told?
Yeah, and I'm glad this one came in ahead of time too, because obviously a lot of my client, pretty much all the client data is confidential. But there was a project that we worked on that was a little bit more public that I can talk about at a high level. It was discrimination, and it was such a cool project because the question ultimately was, is this test fair to both genders? And does one gender have an unfair advantage? And it was pretty neat to see how it played out in the data, and how we wound up telling the story of this is actually, I think it did wind up being unfair to women. And it was just a really neat thing to see how data can answer a question like that, and how we could make charts and visualizations and create a narrative from the numbers to show that and how that worked out. So I can also just kind of briefly talk about data stories in general. A good story would have appropriate visualizations, and we talked about in that previous question, in the right places, and simple, clear colors, all that. A narrative arc. And then you actually do have to tell a story. I mean, there's also an actual story element of like, if the New York Times is publishing a story about nurses in America, maybe they'll follow a particular nurse and say, Rebecca, the nurse, comes home from work after a 12-hour shift. And maybe Rebecca is a typical data point in a data set. So they're pulling out her story to kind of give you an idea of the data set. It's also common to do the opposite and pull out an outlier and talk about that. So yeah, you do have to kind of actually tell a story sometimes in that way too, or in other ways for it to be impactful.
I'm sure with the breadth of experience you've had doing so many different things, you have so many interesting, not only data sets, but stories from those data sets. I can't even imagine. Another good question in the chat. Can you recommend a good course for learning Python? Is there one that you particularly like? And then how similar is it to R?
Full disclaimer, I teach a Python course for General Assembly. So I think that course is good. I teach it, but there's other ones out there too, and they don't mind me saying that, of course. The data camp is, I know they've had their troubles recently too, and I'm not at all, dismissing that or saying that, and I do encourage everyone to like look into that before making a decision, but their product tends to be very good. And then anything that's really truly tailored for, tailored, like someone actually wrote it. So there's some sites out there, I think, I'm going to say it wrong, Udemy is one of them, or like, I'm not totally sure of Coursera, but the ones where like anybody can submit anything, I probably wouldn't go down that path because it's usually not as high quality. But Udacity, not Udemy, Udacity is usually very good. They also have great courses. I don't know if they have a Python one off the top of my head, but they probably do. And that's someone is actually, writing the material and overseeing it, and they're iterating on it instead of just someone can throw it out there. So all three of the ones that I mentioned do that: General Assembly, Data Camp, and Udacity. And I think any of those or something similar where there's a team of people looking at it would be better than someone else just writing something. And then Python is extremely similar to R, extremely. I started on R actually, and it was really nothing to pick up Python, but it's not easy to just pick up a coding language in general. Like I said, like it takes really long to get down the structures and the for loops and all that. But then once you get it down, it's actually not too bad to move from like Python to R or R to Python, or even Python to JavaScript. I found was actually not a difficult transition either. So, because all these structures are the same in the different languages, it's just slightly different syntax. Like a for loop exists in R and Python and JavaScript. It's just maybe one has parentheses and one has brackets and one has no brackets or parentheses. So yeah, great question.
And actually, my follow-up question to that is, is there a sequence that you think is more beneficial for someone who's learning to code? Where should they start? And then probably what are the easiest transitions from there on?
I don't know if I would say there is a particular sequence. If those are the goals, the ones that I mentioned, I think you could really start with any of them. If I had to pick my favorite language of the three, or the one that I think would be the most useful, I do think it would be Python, just because it has such a wide application to not only data analytics, but other fields too. And I do think that's where a lot of people are going towards. R started as a purely academic thing, like in universities, and purely statistical. And it's definitely kind of getting to the point of where Python is with like deploying things to the web and stuff like that. But I would personally start with Python, but not because I think the sequence thing. I think it's just, a better language generally for most stuff.
Good to know. Great advice. Let's do this question and then we'll get to the question in the chat. So can you talk about journey analytics with a single GUI view across channels and implementation at large organizations?
Yeah, so I haven't done a journey analytics project yet. We haven't had a client come in for that, but I have a friend, or like it's another company that we kind of chat with, who's like very interested in this and was asking me almost the same question, only they're a much smaller organization. And so just for anyone that is maybe not familiar with journey analytics, it's the idea of where does your customer go along, when you first make contact with them up until they purchase, and how many people are dropping off at each point. Like if they visit your website and then don't purchase, you lose so many, but then there's so many that do visit the website and get to the shopping cart and maybe they drop off there. And I'm giving basic examples. It gets much more complex. I don't know of any programs that do this well. I can tell you that right up front. Like that's a little bit too niche marketing for, we, again, do just purely statistical stuff. But I can talk a little bit about the math, or like math that you could look at for this, because once you have the map in place, if you're not analyzing the data for it, then is it as useful? So obviously the number of people dropping off at each point in the journey from we first met you to actually buying something is super relevant. You could also then talk about the probability of dropping off at a given point, and can we reduce those probabilities over time, and then track that metric. And if you really wanted to get crazy about it, which is, I don't think it's crazy, but you know what I mean? You can really get into the data. You could try to predict whether a given customer will drop off at a given point based on other variables you have about that customer. You'd need a lot of data for that though, like maybe demographic information or behavioral, like did they click here, did they not click here? And then you could run that into like a machine learning algorithm and try to go through that. And there, of course, there's other options too. Those are just three. But yeah, I don't know of a particular program, but I do think it's a worthwhile thing to be looking at data for sure. And I hope that at least answers most of the question. And again, if there's any follow-up questions, please feel free to come off mic and ask.
Yeah, that's a good one. And gosh, journey analytics, even for just emails, I do a lot of that. It's really crazy. So there are lots of facets to that. Another question in the chat is, how often do you use SQL? It's not for data visualization, is it? I think it's more for querying databases.
Yes, yes, and yes. I use SQL all of the time. It is a pretty critical tool, and you're right. It's not the same as an analytics program. Usually, as a data analyst, you're only using SQL to pull data from the database, and then you're pulling it into either Excel, Tableau, Python, whatever, and then doing all of your calculations and visualizations there. You can do some calculations, sorry. You can do some calculations in SQL, not visualizations. SQL doesn't do any charts. But you can do some more basic stuff in SQL in terms of like formulas and whatnot. But if you don't need to, also, why would you? The only reason you'd need to is if it's just such a massive data set that you can't pull it into Excel, or you don't, it's a quick calculation, doesn't make sense to pull it into Excel or Tableau or wherever else. But yep, everything you said is correct. And yes, it's for in the analytics world. I mean, if you're in IT, you might be using SQL for different things, but if you're an analyst, you're pretty much just using it to pull the data or query up the database, talking to the database.
Good questions. Keep them coming, everyone. How do you integrate automated quality assurance into your process?
And yeah, this one also came through ahead of time. I took this as, how do we make sure that when I'm producing something for a client, that it's accurate? And I think that's what this person meant, as opposed to like quality assurance on an assembly line. So if, again, let me know if you meant the other way, but the number one thing that you could do, and this used to annoy me so much, and now I see the value in it, is you need to have an idea of the answer before you even do any calculations. So for example, the classic example is, how many piano tuners are there in Chicago? And maybe you go through a thing in your head of, well, I think the population of Chicago is X million, divide by maybe a family size of 4, so there's X households, and maybe 10% of them have pianos, and sometimes it is going to be annoying, where you have to kind of really think to yourself and go through a bunch of steps to get to a ballpark. It doesn't have to be exact, but do you think the number of piano tuners in Chicago is in the hundreds, the thousands, the millions? And that's, having even that ballpark, I think, is a huge quality or accuracy check. And we do that all the time. I did it at the previous consulting firm where I worked. It was, when we're doing this calculation, even what order of magnitude are we expecting? Because just because Excel or another program gives you an answer, it doesn't mean it's right. And then you also have to be careful of like units. Like I see people make a lot of mistakes often with counting in Excel and stuff too, where they'll count in a pivot table and think it's representing one thing and label it as something and even give it the wrong units, but it's something totally different. And some of that also just comes with practice and time. I know not everybody can go get the 4-year degree, and now there's much more data in the world than there are analysts to crunch the numbers. But it is something where you got to get used to working with numbers, and you start to catch these errors and become better at identifying issues. And when I hire someone, I test them in this exact thing, because accuracy is obviously everything. If you have bad data in, bad data out, and if you have junk, it's not going to be useful. So yeah, it's a great question.
And Tisha has a question, follow up in the chat to this. How do you come up with that ballpark idea?
Yeah, sometimes it's tough. I mean, like with the piano tuner example, in that case, you're literally just kind of going through a series of steps and like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is this and this. Sometimes it's research. Like if you can look up the number of people that live in Chicago. I mean, and again, not the greatest example because it's not real world. I'm trying to think of a more recent real world example that is not confidential, but you need context, of course, too. Like, if you happen to know that the population of Chicago is in the millions or can look it up, oftentimes when you're working at a company, you will have context for these things, or you can even ask someone. It's not that you have to come up with it on your own, and asking is fine, and searching online is fine, or even just saying, well, I'm dividing, something in the hundreds by something in the tens, so I'm expecting something else in the 10, something like that. It's not certainly not just total guesswork.
And I think obviously I'm in marketing. We check our work as far as writing goes all the time. Do you have people that check your calculations, check your visualizations, all of those things? Or is it something that really just checks itself?
No, we check everything internally, of course, before submitting to a client. It's like I said, too, a lot of it is that I don't want to call it intuition. I don't like that word because you can learn it. It's not something you need to be born with, but that familiarity with numbers, and you're used to working with numbers, and you get to have that learned intuition, if you will, of expecting a certain result, or kind of having a feeling like, if this number if my sales are in the hundreds, that's probably wrong. My company sales are probably in the thousands or millions or whatever. And that's obviously an easy example. It gets harder. So yeah, it's definitely checking all the time too. And double checking your work, just like you would anywhere.
Another question from the chat. Do you have any experience working with open source government data sets? Do you ever do analysis in support of public policy? And would this be something you or BoxPlot would want to do?
Yeah, we would totally do a government project. We had a school call once actually recently, but then they, and I did offer obviously generous discount, but then I think they just wound up dropping the project. But yeah, we do nonprofit and government projects too. And I've worked with a couple of, open source data sets. I'm actually a volunteer for Code for America in my spare time. I don't know if you're all familiar with the organization, but they do data stuff too, but it's also coding. So I'm in Philadelphia. So our chapter is called Code for Philly, and I'm on the leadership team. And that's all they do actually is open source government projects. So they'll take data or, whatever from the city of Philadelphia, see what they need, and then complete the project and do that. So yeah. I mean, government data sets, especially in the previous consulting firm I worked for, we also did a lot of government work as well, in addition to legal. So sometimes the government ones can be messier. I've noticed that, but doable.
Awesome. And we'll have to give your contact and everything out again at the end, because I think you did at the beginning. But so our next question is, I'm enhancing my Excel skills and learning Tableau. I love data visualizations and currently use Illustrator and After Effects and Excel to pull data. If I need to add one more skill to round out my skill set and become credible in doing this work, what would it be?
That's a tough one. I guess the first thing that comes to mind would be SQL, because I do think one of the top skills, I assume this person is, when they say becoming credible in doing this work, data analysis. And just a pure data analyst, like not a data scientist. If you're looking for a data analyst, then I think SQL would probably be the next step, because if you've got Excel and Tableau, that's great. I don't even think you'd need necessarily Tableau, because again, I think a lot of places don't want to pay for it. But if the next thing is almost always I hear from people is I need to pull the data from the database, or I'm tired of waiting for others to pull the data from the database. So yeah, I think SQL would be the one that I would pick. If you're going for data science though, then it's a long, hard road, and it's much, much more Python and the heavier stats and machine learning and all that. But for data analyst, SQL.
And high level, Barb, and actually we're doing a blog post on this, so selfishly going to ask this question, but what is the difference between a data analyst and a data scientist?
Yeah, it is a huge difference, and I get this question a lot. So data analyst is a great job, and it usually pays well and is comfortable, and it's pretty much usually just you're pulling data from SQL, you're exporting it to an analytics program, Excel, Tableau, whatever. You're doing visualizations, maybe some lighter calculations, and presenting your results to the person that asked, and then rinse and repeat. And you're not often, or usually ever, expected to use Python or R, like a full-blown coding language, or do any kind of heavier statistics or modeling or anything like that. But again, it's a great job. Data science is like I said, much harder, much longer road, where you are going to have to know either Python or R, usually one of those. Possibly, shouldn't say never, I rarely see anything other than Python or R for the language. You would need heavier statistics, regression, hypothesis testing, and then you'd also need machine learning, predictive modeling, and then usually you also need to know how to use a big data program like Apache Spark or one of those. So yeah, data scientist is a lot more. And we do data science work too. Most of the people that work with me have bachelor's or master's in stats, so they've done those things in those degrees. Not that you always need a degree to do it, but it is the point I'm getting at, it's a longer process to learn for sure.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Very in-depth. Our next question is, how do you identify which variables to consider when calculating the probability of a deal closing? Step-by-step regression analysis, teach me.
Yeah, I wish that we could get into that in the call. Obviously, you saw the list of questions in the beginning, so I can't go through a full-blown teaching of that whole thing, but I can answer the question. There's a couple dependencies here. I think stepwise regression was a great thought, and I could totally see a logistic regression of like, did this deal close or not, or what's the probability, and you're adding variables as you go. I guess the thing with the stepwise is you have to have an idea of which variables are going to be important, which it kind of sounds like by the wording of this question that this person does not know which variables might be important, in which case, if you truly have no idea, which usually you can take a pretty good guess, right? Like if it's a probability of a deal closing, maybe it's the number of times that you were contacted before the deal closed, or maybe it's the amount of number of employees that company has, because you know that that's your target market. Like usually you do have some idea of the variables that will be relevant, in which case that path that you said would work out. If you really truly have no idea, and you just have a bunch of variables and you're like, I just want to throw them at the wall and see what happens, you could do a more like supervised learning model, like machine learning. So the one that comes to mind, and I'd have to see it all, of course, so keep that in mind. I'm not saying this is definitively the answer, but like a decision tree where you're saying, is this variable critical to determining if yes or no the deal is going to close, and predicting that. So I guess it depends on how strongly you feel about the variables that you have. If you could, pick ones that you think would be more relevant, and then if so, I think the way that you started out was the way to go. And you can message me after if you want to go further into this for sure.
Great. And again, if anyone has follow-up questions or additional things that they want to add, feel free to keep popping your questions in the chat. Our next question is, do you have any advice on how to use data to help market an insurance company? Can you give an example of how you used one or more tools, Tableau, oh gosh, is it
Click.
Click? Okay.
Yeah.
Click, Python, SQL, etc. at the insurance company you previously worked for?
Yeah, so I actually, at that insurance company, almost exclusively served the marketing department. So this is a great question. They would ask us questions. So for example, sometimes it was as broad as just just tell us about what's happening on Facebook. Like we want a dashboard that's showing us all the metrics. And this was before Facebook had their own analytics, but quite frankly, I don't think Facebook's analytics platform or like little thing that they give you is very good anyway. It's a bunch of line charts, and usually companies have much more specific questions than Facebook will show you in their dashboard anyway. So we would pull the data from the Facebook API and look at it and say, there's a downward trend in likes, this is concerning, or you notice if you post this time of day, you'll get more visibility. Like that kind of stuff can help with marketing efforts for sure. And then other times it was also just pulling existing sales data to try to determine either useful tips for writing marketing articles, or who to target, who's a common demographic, and things like that. So yeah, that's the kind of data that we worked with. In terms of the tools, I guess I shouldn't say this, but I don't like Click. That was one of the ones I was thinking of before with that previous question. I don't think they're a good platform to use. We talked about Tableau. They're fantastic, but expensive. And then I think what people might be missing here is like all the ones, Excel, Tableau, Click, Python, they're all pretty much doing the same thing. Obviously not exactly. We talked about differences, like Tableau is better with maps, and obviously Python is, you can just do anything you can imagine with Python. It's not going to have any of the restrictions of the other point and click programs. You can do all the heavier stats with that too. But they're all at the same goal of like analysis and visualization. SQL is separate in that you're just pulling the data. So you almost always need SQL or some kind of method of pulling the data. And then, yeah, you'd use any of those tools to do the analysis. And I won't repeat it since we've gone through it now, but you all understand the differences by this point of how to pick which one.
Awesome. And I love this question in the chat. How often do you encounter members of teams that prefer to trust their gut, especially in sales environments? Do you have any tips to talk about the value of data? And moreover, how would you encourage a client to continue making analysis an ongoing effort instead of a one-off project?
Okay, we'll start with the gut thing. I actually usually encourage people not to follow their gut. Not always. I mean, if you have a really good context and you've been at a company for years and you know that an answer is wrong, then of course that makes sense. But people often have a very bad gut when it comes to numbers. I have a funny example of I was working with a friend on a project at a local florist shop, and they're like, our conversion rate is 90%. 90% of people that call here wind up becoming customers. Is great. Well, when we looked at the numbers, it was 16%. Like people tend to be very, very off with what they think is reality when it comes to stuff like that. Not because it's just the way we are. Maybe you want it to be a certain way or whatever. And that's why the hypothesis tests exist too, where, is something statistically significant? Like two numbers might seem really far away to us, but when you take all the other things into consideration, like standard deviation and all the pieces that go into a hypothesis test, they might not actually be statistically significantly any different realistically from each other. And again, that kind of gets into wording, and it's a whole different thing when I say that. But you get it. They're different numbers. They're just not really that far apart. So that would be my answer to the gut one. What was the second question?
Moreover, how would you encourage a client to continue to make analysis on ongoing efforts instead of just a one-off project?
Yeah, I always think the benefit of analysis is you're not just guessing, right? You're using data to make informed decisions. So it almost always has a positive impact on the goals of the organization, whether it's increasing profits, increasing employee satisfaction, more successful marketing campaigns, more followers, more use, whatever the goal is, you can actually use evidence to make your decision. So I think that's the strongest argument, I guess, for continued analytics. And of course, the numbers are always changing. You have to monitor them. You know, right? If you do a one-off project and you've got a report, and now it's, you know, it used to be if it was 5 years old, but now even if it's 6 months ago, it might be out of date at that point. Things are so quickly changing. So yeah, it kind of relates to the gut thing of you don't want to use your gut. You don't want to guess. You want the evidence and the numbers to back the decision, so you're more confident you're making a smarter decision.
And I mean, let's be real here. Numbers don't lie. So, I mean, perhaps it's going to take you a little extra effort to pull the numbers and do the analysis. But I mean, assuming that once you set it all up and you're, you know, kind of running reports and capturing that data, this is something that you can kind of scale over time. It just seems like, I mean, someone can't say no to a number, you know, like they can't, it's hard. So for me, a non-numbers person, I just don't know how someone can look at data and not disagree, I guess.
Right.
Oh, good questions. So this may not fit in the scope of what you're discussing, but I have a chemical engineering background and I'm trying to break into business/data analytics with no luck from potential employers. Should I invest in coding certificates on my own to make myself more marketable?
Again, I'll repeat the disclaimer. I do a lot of work for General Assembly. I do think that, well, let me start then with, I'll start the other way. I don't believe master's degrees anymore are as useful as they were. I know that's not the question, but I'm starting with that. I think it's a lot of money, and it doesn't. I've had a lot of people tell me, you know, just kind of, I'm very in this space, that they felt it hasn't paid off for them. So I don't know if I would go the direction of a, you know, another degree, full-blown degree. Also because they tend to be very theoretical. If you can find one more data science forward, that might be a different story. But a master's in pure stats, unless you want to, you know, really get into it. I'm saying, you know, master's in stats is great for other things, but I don't know if it's going to necessarily, I don't know if you have to go that far at this point, especially since there's a shortage of data analysts. I think the most important thing that you can have is an example of doing this in the past, or like things that you can show to prove that you know what you're doing. And I think that's the case probably for almost any industry. Some of the certification programs will, and boot camps will give you that. I think almost all of them now have projects that you can take away. So if you are going to go with one, I would look for one that at least gives you something that you can walk away with and then show in an interview to an employer. The other thing I would say is I would go to a Code for America or one of those other groups where you can actually do projects for free and get yourself out. And honestly, oftentimes people will stand up there and be like, I'm offering a job right now. You know, it's like a very common thing that they do. So those meetup groups, you know, meetup.com, those are great places for getting real world experience that you can show in interviews, and then also literally just networking for jobs. So roundabout answer is I don't think it'll necessarily hurt, you know, to have the certification. The key, I would say, is the experience and being able to show that you've done it.
Awesome. And a good kind of related question in the chat. Are there any tricky interview questions that pop up when, you know, that might stump candidates when interviewing for data science or data analyst roles?
The piano tuners in Chicago is a very common interview question, actually. But yeah, I think that they're testing people more and more now, especially with SQL. So there's a really wonderful website called hackerrank.com, and you can practice SQL questions for free. And HackerRank is actually a service that companies use to test applicants. So you might even get similar questions in your actual interview. I don't know how much they really test with the Excel side of things or Tableau. I think it would mostly be a SQL test, but I haven't applied for a job in a very long time now, so I can't say with certainty. But yeah, those questions, and then the analytical ones of like, that's what, you know, how you think, which is what the piano tuners in Chicago is attempting to do. Those would be the two I would say were probably top of the list for interview tests.
Good to know. Okay, let's see. I have over 15 years experience in several major reporting, BI, and data viz tools as popularity and tech shifted every few years. Now it's time to shift again. What is a modern elevator pitch to convince a new potential client or employer that they want me to apply past experience to use their latest tool investment like Tableau, even though I don't have projects under my belt in that exact software?
I had one more thought on the last question before I answer this one. I promise it'll be brief. I think I mentioned earlier in the call that we test candidates. And I just wanted to follow up that that's what we test on, is the type of things like piano tuners in Chicago and can you spot the error type of thing. So sorry, I just wanted to add that. For the new question here, yeah, I mean, I do think it's so important to stay current. Like if you fall behind, it can get really, really difficult later then to switch to, to the point where it can be really bad for companies' future, especially if that's a critical part of your business. So I think the best argument you could use is they're all extremely similar, especially the point and click programs like Tableau, Click, Power BI. They're all really similar. So like, I can't imagine it's too different from maybe the tool that you're currently using. And then in addition, if you learn this tool, this new tool for your company, it'll still be really useful in these other senses too. And they just have new features. And when people have a version of Excel that's 10 years old, like the differences have become very, very large now. Like there's new charts, there's new ways of managing data and data efficiency and just tools like that are constantly changing. It's like anything, you have to kind of keep up with it. And I do think it's really important. I hope that helps a little bit with the convincing.
Yeah, I definitely think so. So that concludes all of our pre-submitted questions. We have about 5 minutes left. Okay, we got one more in the chat. So this is the time. If you have any other pressing questions, pop them in the chat now, or else we'll send us off here. But here's a good one. If you were sitting across from a DA applicant, what would be the most important question you would ask? And what would be the most important thing you would want to hear?
Yeah, again, it would be that they really understand the numbers, because if they're not producing accurate results, it's either worthless or detrimental, right? It's not going to be good. It's either going to be neutral at best or bad. So I do think that some kind of, I'll show people a pivot table that has counts in it and the wrong units, and I'll see if they can pick that out. I'll show people a visualization and say, what are your thoughts on this? I don't personally ask the exact piano tuners in Chicago question, but something like that, where you're really testing the ability to like think through numbers and work with numbers, as opposed to just like finding the buttons in Tableau and Excel. Because again, like if you're pulling the wrong data from SQL, or crunching the wrong numbers in the actual analytics program, it's not going to be useful. And I hear that a lot when people call us. Sometimes it's because they hired a data analyst who was not qualified and couldn't do what they wanted. So they wound up having to kind of move that person to another department or get rid of them. And then they call us to kind of come in and try again. So I do hear that a lot, and it's usually because of inaccuracy, as opposed to like this person couldn't use the program or whatever. Sometimes it's also just statistics and Python are not things that you can just pick up. So the point and click programs you can pick up pretty quickly, but again, working with the numbers, the actual statistical tests are difficult to understand. It's difficult to pick the right one. There's a lot of like gotchas in there. So if you're looking for that level 2 and that person doesn't have experience in it, I wouldn't go down that path.
Good to know. And I think we did talk about this a little bit earlier, but this person joined the call late. So do you have any recommendation or any recommended tools to understand customer funnel analytics?
Yeah, this is a hot question recently. Like I said, I've been getting it outside of this call too. And I don't know of a particular tool. I mean, I think Google Analytics provides this view, but I don't think they really go very far with it. So like something that we would offer to a client if they wanted it is we would pull the raw data from Google Analytics and then calculate some of the metrics I talked about before, or if, you know, the company had very specific questions that we could answer with the data, we would do that. Some of the metrics I mentioned before were like probability of dropping off, predicting whether someone will drop off based on other characteristics, following the trends of all this over time. Like those are things that we would do with the raw data, and we would just kind of create our own custom dashboard, you know, based on what the company was focusing on. But I don't know of any other, there might be tools out there that do this. I don't know of any. And I think I did recently do a brief Google search too for the friend company I was mentioning and couldn't find anything that was really fantastic. So yeah, in terms of tools, no, but yeah, there's definitely ways to do it from the raw data.
Build one. The easy answer, right? Cool. So we've got about 3 more minutes, probably time for one more question if someone wants to speedily type it in the chat. But while we wait, Barb, I would love for you just to kind of sum us up with how people can contact you afterwards, how they can get involved with Boxplot, just any parting words that you have for the group would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, thank you everyone for coming and for submitting the questions in the chat and ahead of time. I will I'll send an email, a follow-up email to everyone that includes, so you'll have my email address if you want to reach me directly. I'll put my LinkedIn in there if you want to connect. I do run a LinkedIn data analytics question and answer group. So if questions keep coming up, you can post there. I'm actually considering migrating it to Slack in the near future. So you all got the sneak peek of that. But for now, it's still in LinkedIn. And then, yeah, you know, you can also just send me data sets as a sample and, you know, questions. And, you know, even if your company's looking for additional help and you're just not even totally sure, we can even do like a preliminary thing without, you know, charging of like, is this the right fit, and take a look at your data. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. It's never a problem. I can even send you my calendar if you want to schedule another video chat. But yeah, I appreciate everyone coming.
And I have one last question, which I think is a really great one to kind of end on. What would be your ideal project?
Oh, that's tough. The projects that we get. But I think what I really love doing is I do think I like putting together the dashboards most of all. I do also love the hypothesis testing and the heavier stats, but you know, seeing someone open up the dashboard, usually people love that, and we're very great at walking people through stuff as well. So we're not the type of like, here's the dashboard, you know, and then we're done. We walk people through it so that they understand it, and that's also really satisfying to do with clients. So yeah, I think, you know, putting together a dashboard from data and walking people through so they can be like, oh, great, finally, you know, I can make these decisions and feel good about it and kind of visually see what's going on is my favorite thing to do.
I love that. What a great question to end on. So thank you, Barb, so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge. This was wonderful as always. And thank you to everyone for tuning in today, for being so engaged. This was wonderful. So many great questions. I really appreciate it. And we will see you all back here tomorrow when we talk about, are we too old to learn to code? So if you're interested, make sure to sign up for that chat tomorrow. And thanks again, Barb. We'll see you all again next time.
Bye.